Grammont, local resident, and I guess I'll start by saying that I've never considered myself a military analyst or a professional, but I get paid to do this sort of thing, and so I guess I am. So just a little bit of background. I started being interested in warfare when I was young, and instead of just being content with watching war movies or whatever, I started getting into history, and that led to a degree in history. One of my professors actually was Ukrainian, and I got my Russian studies from him. And the two overlapped, and I got into military simulations, or otherwise known as wargaming, and that is what I do professionally, and have done so for the last 25 years or so. And had the interesting misfortune of being at the tail end of making a war game about Russia invading Ukraine in 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine. So that kind of put a monkey in our whole release plan, because we now had a war going on for something that we had predicted, and actually fairly accurately, but we didn't think it was going to happen right as we were finishing it. So obviously an area of interest for me. Long before this war, we were expecting, and I'll say, I'm going to switch between I and we interchangeably as I go through this. Everything I say is my opinion, but I'm not alone in how I form my opinion. So there's other people that I consult and read or discuss things with. So I'm just going to say we, but it's not a formal, like there's an organization that I'm a part of. But we were expecting a second war sooner rather than later, and as things started heating up, starting last summer and going into the winter, we were really starting to pay more attention that it might happen. So what I'm going to do first is to kind of go through some older history, and the reason why I'm doing that is that it is relevant to what is going on today, and there's a lot of misunderstandings about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine and how that all works. I was fortunate in my high school days to have a teacher who was very enlightened and broke away from the traditional memorize dates, names, places, that sort of approach to history, and then test, and if you can remember who died on what day, you got an A. Even if you didn't understand who that person was or what they did. So I had a teacher who approached things the opposite way, which was, it's more important to understand how history is all tied together and the order that things happen in. And if you need to figure out a date or a person, you come to a library. It's easy enough to do. But understanding how things work is really where it is at. So that here, I'm gonna fly through this stuff. We got to go all the way back to the 9th century. Kievan Rus was really the first organized large section of this part of the world that was under one rule, and up until then it was just the usual tribes going around and beating each other on the head and poking each other with sticks. Kievan Rus was the first real organized civilization in that area. It stretched eventually all the way from the Black Sea all the way up to the Arctic Circle in kind of a straight upward motion. So you had the Germanic tribes and other things happening, the Ottomans and the leftovers of the Romans on one side, and then you had the Asiatics on the other side. So next comes the Mongols, who came in and basically knocked everybody out, destroyed Kiev. Kiev actually existed as a city, and that was one of the first things the Mongols destroyed. And you got to remember that this was a time when people just went around in large hordes, raping, pillaging, killing, murdering, and then moving on. Not a great time to be alive. And that is a history of this area, is kind of a bashing of two peoples, the European peoples and the Asiatic peoples, and this is often where they fought. So the Mongols dominated until about the 15th century, at which point it was called the Duchy of Moscow, which had been a part of Kievan Rus, but obviously several hundred years later had developed into its own fiefdom. They had figured out how to work with the Mongols, and then when the Ottomans got in there and started weakening the Mongols, they said, okay, it's our time, and they went and became their own thing. And that eventually changed into the Russian Empire. So that lasted quite a while. They were very, very successful, the Russians, in conquering everything around them and going all the way out to the Pacific. That all fell apart with World War I, when things were already not so great for the Russian Empire, and Germany hit them real hard, and everything boiled over. We had the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks, but there were other players involved. Things were pretty brutal, and the civil war that ensued for the next few years was extremely bloody, and there was a lot of different players involved. So then that all settled down, became the Soviet Union, and then there was a period of time when under Lenin and then under Stalin, where it was consolidation of power and implementation of the Soviet system, and that gets us to Holodomor, which was a famine in Ukraine, which killed upwards of around 3 million people. And there's still debate to this day as to how much of it was deliberate, how much of it was just gross incompetence, and how much of it was just really bad timing with weather and other things. My personal belief is that it was a combination of all three. At the very least, the rulers in Moscow were indifferent to the deaths of millions of people. They just really didn't care. So much for that brotherhood thing. But the Ukrainians basically believed that they were murdered. And that is more important than what any of us think, is they believe that Moscow murdered 3 million of their people, and they have not forgotten that. So then we get into the Great Patriotic War, which is what we refer to as World War II. During that period of time, from 41 to 44, the Germans occupied Ukraine. This is hard to believe, but as bad as the Nazis were to the Ukrainians, they preferred the Nazis. They thought that if they were going to throw their lot into one or the other, they would rather have Hitler come on top than Stalin. And that just gives you an idea of how awful Stalin was. There were, of course, Ukrainians that were pro-Soviet, but for the most part, the Soviets had a very tough time after the war. The Ukrainians did not want to go back under Soviet control, and they fought, like as in armed resistance, all the way up until formally 1949. So 4 years after the war ended, the Soviet troops were still running around Ukraine being shot at and shooting people. And some amount of insurgency continued into the early 1950s. To frame that, that's the same time that the Soviet Union was clamping down on Hungary, and yet in their own backyard they were still having domestic problems. All right. So after Stalin, things got better. It's hard to get worse. They basically, under Khrushchev, things got kind of settled down. This is when Crimea was officially transferred from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. The Russians never forgot that. And so things went kind of, as we all know, we all lived through this period of time. And so in 1987, Gorbachev, things started to change. So we have what is called the Soviet dissolution. The Soviet Union started to break apart before it broke apart. They were trying to do it quietly, softly, by giving areas more autonomy, loosening up the economy. There was now a certain degree of political expression was allowed, so on and so forth. But it didn't work because nobody liked the Russians, and the Russians were still dominating everything. So in 1991, there was a coup attempt to undo Gorbachev's reforms. That failed, and everybody took that opportunity to say goodbye to Russia. Not everybody, but the Baltic republics, Georgia and Armenia, and one other one. They all left early while this turmoil was going on. Ukraine gained some more independence inside of what was still called the Soviet Union, but in December of 1991, all the members of what was still the Soviet Union voted to dissolve the Soviet Union, and so everybody went their own way. We had the Budapest Memorandum, which is important for political aspects of the war. In 1994, Ukraine had a whole bunch of nuclear weapons. Ukraine didn't want the nuclear weapons. Russia didn't want them to have the nuclear weapons. The West would rather have nobody have nuclear weapons over there. So there was an agreement that said, Ukraine, you give up all the nuclear weapons on your soil and nobody will screw with you. That was the agreement. Russia said, that's fine. We said, that's fine. Ukraine said, that's fine. So that was the deal. Neutrality, Ukraine would be neutral. Nobody would mess with them. And so that was the understanding we went into, going into where we're headed next. So Ukraine was still ruled by, as were most of the Soviet republics, were still ruled by pretty nasty Soviet-type people that were extremely corrupt and not all that interested in sharing power. So there was the Orange Revolution in 2004 between a candidate, Yanukovych, who's going to come up later, and, oh shoot, I'm just going to forget his name. Anyway, another guy. And what happened there was Russia didn't like the other guy, whose name I'm now going mind blank on, so they poisoned him with dioxin, and his face got all messed up, but he survived, and he managed to win. So Russia already was showing that they had no interest in Ukraine being its own country, because Yanukovych was in the pocket of Moscow. So the revolution was because they were obviously trying to interfere with the vote, the Russians were, and so everyone out in the street calmed down, their guy won, so everything was fine for a little while. And then, so Ukraine had a functioning democracy, not a great one, extremely corrupt, all kinds of nasty stuff was happening in there, but it was still recognizable, it would be recognizable to us as a democracy. Then what happened was Yanukovych got voted in legitimately, and because there is a large section of Ukraine that is pro-Russia, and that has to do with deliberate things that the Russians have done over centuries, which is scoop out a population in the area that you invaded, kill them or move them someplace else, and then take Russians and put them in place. And therefore, you will always have Russians in some place that will be dependent upon you. And that allows them to interfere with internal politics. And it worked really well, unfortunately. So what happened with Euromaidan is that the Ukrainian people wanted to move towards the West, and they wanted to be integrated with the European economy, with the rest of the world. Russia didn't want them to. So Yanukovych was in the pocket, and so Yanukovych knew politically that he really didn't have the flexibility, but he tried to join what Russia was proposing as a counterbalance to the European Union. It's called the Customs Union, was part of it. And Yanukovych was supposed to sign a memorandum of understanding with the European Union, and instead he said, nope, I'm going to sign the one with Russia. And so hundreds of thousands of people got out into the streets and said, we are not happy with that. That dragged on through December and into January. Russia was not pleased that this was happening, that the riot police weren't able to, amazingly enough, were not able to club a couple 100,000 people and make that effective. So the thing you have to understand with Putin, and I'll put this in later on, is that he loves to have options. And so he sent in some of his best nasty guys to start shooting the protesters to try to get them to disperse. That didn't work, and instead brought down the Yanukovych government, and Yanukovych had to run to Russia, left his golden toilet behind, and yes, he had one. And so that was the Euromaidan revolution. And the Europeans were all very happy about this because Yanukovych was not good, and Ukraine wanted to go this route, so thumbs up from the West. So I'm going to stop there on the Ukraine side, just kind of skip back to Russian history. Russian independence happened at the same time as Ukraine, December 1991. They very quickly had a constitutional crisis. Boris Yeltsin decided that the presidency should be the more stronger part of the Russian federal government, and the equivalent of our Congress, the Duma, said no. So they were holed up in the equivalent of Congress, and he sent in tanks. And so that was solved with a whole bunch of tank fire into the building. And after that, amazingly enough, he got to have more powers. Then we have the first Chechen War, which was Chechnya is a part of the Russian Federation that is Islamic and down in the Caucasus, and they don't like Russians. So they revolted. The Russian military went in there, was humiliated, and had to leave. Then the second Chechen War happened. Now we've got Putin in power. Putin did a whole bunch of what are called false flag attacks, which is blowing up your own people and saying somebody else did it. That's his favorite one. So he blew up an apartment building in Moscow, blamed it on the Chechens, went in for the second war. Things didn't go well either. Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, was resisting, so he leveled it, and upwards of 80,000 people were killed in that. But then, money can solve a lot of things. He bribed one of the two major factions and said, look, you switch sides, I'll put you in power, and I'm going to pay you every year. And so they switched, and Second Chechen War ended in 2000, and it has been relatively stable. They had terrorist activities for a number of years after that, but the war part of it ended. So then in 2008, Georgia is another one that Russia's got a big beef with. Russia does these things, which is they infiltrate areas on their border, get things all agitated, and then invade to say, well, we've got to come and sort this out with our peacekeepers. And the joke is peacekeeper in Russian means keep a piece of whatever you go into. So with the Russo-Georgian War, the Georgians made a huge mistake. The Russians had set them up. The Georgians bit. They shelled a particular city, which had separatists in it. And then, what do you know, the Russian troops came flying in there, and Georgia was not ready for that. Now, it's very clear that the Russian army was all gassed up and ready to go, so this whole thing was just a pretext. They took a whole bunch of sections of Georgia that they wanted. They set them up as semi-autonomous republics and under the protection of the Russian government. So then we get into 2011. Russia, up until this point, had a somewhat functional democracy at the lower level. It wasn't great, but there was some, and freedom of speech was pretty much there unless you really pissed Putin off, and then you were thrown out a window or shot, killed, murdered in some horrible fashion. But for the most part, you could say, you could express a political opinion, just don't have too much of a voice. 2011 was elections, and there were obviously ballot stuffing and all kinds of things, and so people got out in large numbers. Putin thought that this was a CIA conspiracy, and so that started a whole series of clampdowns on public expression, which continued up until about this war. Now there's pretty much none. Then we get to the first Russo-Ukrainian War. We don't have names for these wars officially yet, but that's what most people say. So in August 2014, that's what I already described, Russia was not pleased with the way that things were going in Ukraine and decided to settle it militarily. So I'm going to move aside from the rapid firing of the historical things and start talking more generally here. Ukraine does have a large section that is Russian, and they believe Russia has a higher standard of living up until fairly recently, and Russia's strong and all of that. So a lot of people have the opinion that it would be better to be aligned with Russia. On top of that, there's a lot of organized crime, which is tied into Russia, and so they had oligarchs and just regular common organized crime was tied into a couple of very large Moscow-based crime syndicates. So there's that as well. And then there's a whole bunch, the majority of Ukraine is looking westward. So say a third of the country maybe is looking eastward, and 2/3 of the country are looking westward. The two are not compatible. That has set up a lot of tensions within inside of the government and inside of society in general. Ukraine is, as with all ex-Soviet republics, extremely corrupt, and that was part of the state institutions. They have done better than other ex-Soviet republics in terms of trying to deal with it, and after the 2014 crisis, have taken a lot more steps towards it. Still got a ways to go, but all of the the former Warsaw Bloc countries that are part of the European Union now all have these same problems at some point. And for the most part, they've gotten through very well. Even the more corrupt countries such as Bulgaria and Hungary are still light years ahead of where they started. Relations with the West were always good, but not necessarily strong. Relations with Russia were traditionally stronger, and after 2014 went into the toilet. And even a lot of Russians, people who were previously predisposed to being influenced by Russia, after 2014, they picked a side, and a lot of them picked the side of Ukraine, which was a big surprise to Putin. He thought that there would just be this huge uprising of anybody who spoke Russian, and that really didn't happen. So what has been happening, especially since 2014, is the government has been trying to settle this whole thing once and for all for the West. There was only one political party that was still openly siding with Russia, and as soon as this war started, amazingly, most of them left the country because they realized that they were not going to be welcome if Russia didn't get its way, or whether Russia got its way or not, they just realized that they should probably leave, and so that happened. Russia's path forward from the time that they became an independent country, these things are all very, very important to what's going on now. Internal stability is the most important thing to Russians. After the Soviet Union collapsed, everybody was floundering. They didn't know what the heck was going on. There was hyperinflation, the oligarchs, rise of the oligarchs, who were the black marketeers during the Soviet days. They made life pretty miserable for people. And they had hyperinflation. People were starving. It was awful. So they don't want to ever go back to that. Oddly enough, that's where they're headed. But this has been one reason why they've put up with a lot of authoritarian type behavior, because they prefer that to chaos. More recently, there's been a very directed attack against the values of the West. This is one reason why a lot of right-wing organizations in the West love Putin, because he's anti-gay, anti-woman, just misogynistic to an extreme. Don't like people with dark skin. I mean, the list goes on and on. So right-wing groups are pretty pleased with him. Putin himself really wanted to reestablish the Soviet Union, not as the Soviet Union, but to reestablish its place in the world as the Soviet Union had. And that is why we're in the mess we're in right now. Because Russians in general, but him specifically, believe that they are really supposed to dominate everybody. That's why they think that's why they're on Earth, is to dominate as many people as they can. And I'm not really being flippant. They really believe that this is the way that it is supposed to be. And that is what they call the near abroad, which would be all of the ring around the Soviet Union, including the Baltic states, Eastern Europe, and they don't care so much about Asia, but a little bit in Asia. But it's mostly the Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, those kinds of places. They believe that they should be controlling all of that. One way they do that is through military intimidation. Hey, do what we want or we'll invade you. And considering they're a huge country with a big military budget, that is pretty effective. Then we get into a very complicated topic called hybrid warfare, which is trying to do all kinds of things to your opponent other than just going in and bombing them. It's cyber attacks, it is political influence, it's economic blackmail. For example, during the 2014 conflict, they turned the pipelines off to Europe for a little bit in the middle of winter, just to show them that they could. So that is part of hybrid warfare. And there's embracing of fascism. Russia today is a fascist state by any definition. And it has been growing that way through Putin's time in power slowly. As I said, at first he didn't really mind people having a public opinion. That was okay, as long as you just didn't be too noisy about it. Doesn't care about corruption unless you steal from the wrong people. Then you lose all your assets or you get thrown out a window. These things happen quite frequently. Or you get poisoned. That's another one. So that has been increasing. Over time, it's kind of inversed. At first, he would concentrate on a small amount of people that he didn't like. Now it's the opposite. He's really clamped down on pretty much all of society. And part of that is because the economic reforms that he had implemented early on were done by smart people that he allowed the freedom to come to him with ideas, and they really did improve the economy. They did knock down some degree of corruption, the common corruption that you would see, like police shaking you down when they pull you over for a speeding ticket, that sort of thing. They're still stealing billions of dollars from people, but you didn't see it on a day-to-day basis. That really started to fall apart in 2014. the West imposed a whole bunch of sanctions on Russia. They weren't very strong, but they've had a lasting effect, and it's kind of been a slow burn, coupled with massive corruption, incompetence, clamping down on people. Their economy has been headed down, and permanently. Well, permanently is not the right word for it, but not just a cyclical up and down thing, I mean just down. And people were starting to grumble, and that if you are a dictator, grumbling people is not something you like. So grabbing Crimea and forcefully annexing it in 2014 shot his popularity up, and people were willing to put up with a lot more crap because, hey, we now have Crimea. This is important, even though I can't feed my kids and my healthcare stinks. This is the crazy thing. Stuff that we think is illogical is, if you've ever had discussions with Russians, it's difficult. It really is difficult. They just do not think the way that we think. And part of the reason why is they have been under an autocratic system for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the best and the brightest and the most targeted of their citizens leave or get thrown out a window. So they do not have the civic discussions that we do. So they are really unaware of things, and on top of that, we've got all of this stuff. So Russia's really gone from an oligarchy to what I would call fascism light to fascism heavy, and that's where we're at now. They had a veneer of responsible state. They had pretty much all the stuff that we would expect a government to do, they were doing. Weren't doing it well, and it was all buddies being put into positions and then everybody stealing from each other. But it did look like a functioning state. Over time, Putin has tried to rehabilitate the Soviet Union. The best example of that was that there was a museum to the gulags of Stalin. Pretty much everybody understands that murdering 20 or 30 million of your own people is not a really good thing. So they had a museum to it, just like they would Auschwitz. Well, state funded, Putin pulled the funding, and now you're not allowed to talk about that. And that happened a number of years ago. That was just one example of trying to sweep all of the nasty crimes of the Soviet Union under the carpet so that you could then say the Soviet Union's great. And it should be said that the Soviet Union killed more people than the Nazis did. And they did it over a longer period of time, and they made more people miserable because they, unlike the Nazis, they lasted for a good 50 years, and the Nazis didn't. So in terms of impact on people, they had one, and we even us in the West kind of downplay how bad the Soviet Union was in terms of human rights and just simply killing people. So any good fascist state requires an enemy, and so the enemy is us. It's everybody in the West. It's the European Union, it's individual countries, and it's in particular NATO. And if you have an enemy, you need to have a military. So they spend an ungodly amount of their revenue on the military. And fat load of good it did them. Then there's Putin's aim of destabilizing the West. That's driving wedges between allies. It means trying to create social strife, and that gets into the international influence campaign. This is where he's had a lot of success. He didn't come up with this on his own. The Soviet Union did it a lot, but didn't have as much success with it as he has. Is taking all the petrodollars, all the money he gets from oil and stuff, and buying people. The amount of Russian money that has flowed into the Western countries to buy influence is astonishing. The joke is London has been nicknamed Londongrad because the amount of Russians that lived in London and own property there, which is one of the best ways of laundering money. Because the goal is to destabilize us, Putin doesn't care who he funds. So he'll fund a far left group, a far right group, doesn't matter. He'll fund both. So we got things like the XL pipeline. Guarantee you there was Russian money opposing the pipeline because that pipeline would be competition for him. Black Lives Matter. There were Russian organizations set up to create Black Lives Matter protests in cities and towns to try to get agitation, and they were militant. And Facebook is probably, everybody's heard about how complacent Facebook was about this stuff. That was one of the major ways that some guy in St. Petersburg was screwing up things here. And it's very inexpensive, and it's deniable, which, unlike flying a bomber or something in, this is much harder to prove and much harder to combat, and very effective. Sometimes it's more obvious, sometimes not. Sometimes with politicians it's pretty obvious. Sometimes with people on CNN speaking about things, you wouldn't know that they're in the pay of the Russians, but if you know what the Russian talking points are, you can start hearing the same lingo. It's been way more apparent lately and very difficult to combat. However, we've learned from 2014, and it's been progressing, and the 2016 elections and things like that have woken us up. So Putin's goals, he says a lot of goals, but they're really going to be boiling down to this: maintaining his own power, not surprisingly, top of his list. The way things work usually there is that when you are the dictator and you hand it over to the next dictator, you are supposed to be given retirement. That's kind of the understanding. And so he wants to make sure that he hands over power to somebody that will honor that. So that because I mean, he's not expecting to be a dictator for life if he makes it to, say, 90. He's probably going to want to retire at some point. He's just about 70. But he doesn't want to see this crashing down. He wants to reestablish national power, which is kind of the reestablishment of the Soviet Union, and he wants to diminish the West's power. These are two separate things. He doesn't just want to be powerful, he wants to make sure he's more powerful than the West, and the only way to do that is to weaken the West. And then everything else that he says he wants to do or what he stands for, it's all just garbage. It's propaganda. Everything he does is traced back to one of these three things in some way, shape, or form. All right, so I've already spoken most about this, but buying friends and influence, compromat, which is you've got the goods on somebody. This is a famous Russian thing. So yeah, we got dirty pictures of you, so you should vote this way, or you should give us a contract for something. They love compromat. And that's not just with us, that also is within inside of Russia and all the other countries that they have influence or wish to have influence in. Assassination, they'll do it. They recently, so 2016 or so, they tried to assassinate people in Montenegro. So, yeah, assassination of individuals. We all have heard about the poisoning of the Skripals in Great Britain. Doesn't care what the territory is. He'll do it. He'll kill people here in this country if that's where they are. The proxy covert warfare, which I spoke about already, which is to foment some kind of trouble somewhere, fund it, get it going, make it work for you. And then conventional warfare, I listed a number of things that Russia has actually used their military forces on, including Ukraine right now. And that's just the conventional aspect of it. Cyber warfare, they've been attacking all of us for years, shutting down things, infecting us, stealing information, whatever it is. And then information warfare, which is the big one. That is where we get into this. The misinformation and disinformation are slightly different. One is to misinform somebody, and one is to inform them of something that's completely wrong. This is a slight difference in that. Whataboutism, which is a favorite of theirs. So you say, I think that what you're doing is wrong. And they say, but what you did is wrong. Okay, we're not talking about that. We're trying to talk about this. Yes, but what about that? And you can't pin them down on anything. So this is, again, why it's very frustrating to have discussions with Russians. You say things like, okay, well, Putin just assassinated. Well, the West always does that. And let's talk about Cuba, when you tried to assassinate Fidel Castro. Okay, that was a long time ago, and we're not trying to talk about that. But they won't, this is just a shifting of the conversation. And it is maddening. Guise of traditional media. So Russia Today was a slick cable news channel that they put out a number of years ago, 2012 or 13, somewhere around there. And they made it look like a real channel. And I had Russians saying, oh, well, I heard this on Russia Today. And I started realizing, wow, they would have this expert on. And this expert is not an expert, but he speaks English, and so the Russians believe him. And there was one actually from Maine during the 2014 crisis. And he was just some whack job down on the coast. And he was on Russia Today as an expert on something. He had no educational background, no professional history on it. He was just a wackadoo, and they had him on promoting him as if he was like having Henry Kissinger on. And that's what they did. So there's been a lot of pushback against them over time. They're now banned in pretty much all the nations right now. And Russia got all upset about that, censorship and everything. We were just upset that we caught on. Proxy media, they will fund media. So there will be an institute, a think tank, something like that, and you find out they get all their money from Russia. So, hey, what do you know? They've got pro-Russian thinking. Social media troll bot army. They have a building in St. Petersburg staffed by hundreds of people, and their job is to screw around with chat forums. And I kid you not, that is their job. So people have caught on to this, where you're trying to have a chat about something, and then somebody comes on with broken English, and you're like, okay, they call it Putin troll. And then there's the bot army, which is similar, but that is now just AI scripts. And so a human will go in and find a place to put it and just let the AI do the talking. Funding of legitimate organizations. They flood money, whether the organization knows it or not. They will, like the NRA has gotten a lot of money from the Russians. The NRA knows that they got a lot of money from the Russians. But there are other organizations, for example, let's just say a congressperson. They could have money flowing in. It's not coming directly from Russia because there's straw men, there's multiple people involved, but that's ultimately the money came from Russia. So unfortunately, there's Russian money influencing real legitimate organizations. And there's a reason why climate change is a big one for Russia. On the one hand, they love they're funding a lot of the climate denial stuff because they're a petro country. Some joke is that Russia is just a gas station disguised as a country. And so they have no interest in us cutting back on the use of petroleum products. So they fund a lot of the climate denial stuff. And then funding of political movements. Not surprisingly, a lot of the right-wing and far left-wing groups receive money. And right now there is a close vote going to happen in France with Marine Le Pen and she is about as right-wing as you can get. And she received a $30 million loan from Russia. And just today in a debate, Macron was saying, pointing out, you received a $30 million loan from a Russian bank and you haven't paid it back. What's up with that? So, a lot of Russian money out there doing what Russia wants, which is to basically make life miserable for everybody else so they can have an easier time. All right, so now we're going to get to the 2014 First War. We have the Green Men phase, which was when men started showing up, armed men started showing up in Crimea with no markings on their uniforms. And who are they? Putin's like, I don't know. And, well, where did all their equipment come from? And he said this, you can get it on eBay. So these are like modern Russian trucks and things. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. I didn't know eBay had those. So, yeah, men who spoke Russian with Russian accents in Russian uniforms but didn't have Russian markings on it. This is what they call the Green Men, because they overall looked green. Then we had the tourists. This happened in mostly eastern Ukraine, pretty much all the area that's been in combat now. Busloads of Russian tourists came over the border. And then what do you know? There were all kinds of beatings of Ukrainian people trying to protest Yanukovych and things like that. So basically there were the soccer hooligans, there were organized criminals, biker gang, the Moscow Wolves or whatever the heck their name was, were coming over on passports and they were beating everybody. So those were tourists. And so Russia's like, hey, it's not our fault if our tourists get a little out of line and start taking over your buildings. And that's where we get into the separatists. So the tourists came over and tried to lay the groundwork for social unrest. And then all of a sudden, separatist movements started. Oddly enough, they were Russian. They had been involved in other military conflicts. Quite a few of them were members of Russian military special forces. But they were supposedly separatists. So all this armed activity started happening with separatists that were actually Russians. That's how they operated. So that happened in April. In response to that, volunteer battalions started showing up. These were Ukrainians who said, enough is enough. The government we've just thrown out Yanukovych. The central government is kind of in disarray, so we need to take matters into our own hands. And a whole bunch of them formed. One you might have heard of, which is Azov, which attracted a lot of not nice people, neo-Nazis and fascist-minded people. But their goal was to throw the Russians out of Ukraine, so Ukraine basically is like, well, you're okay, because the bigger thing here is to get rid of the Russians. The funny thing is that many of the separatists that came in from Russia were neo-Nazi Russians. So, so much for this kind of denazifying Ukraine by sending in your own Nazis. I don't really, it's a very confusing time. So then Ukraine started doing what was called the Antiterrorist Operation when things got too much out of hand. Too many of the separatists had taken too much land, too many municipal buildings, and they were killing people. It was not nice. So they fired up the army and they went in and they started taking back all the land by force between April and July 2014. Well, Russia didn't like that. So Russia then officially did not attack, but they really did. They fired artillery from Russian soil into Ukraine, killed a whole bunch of Ukrainians, moved in with their forces, killed a whole bunch more Ukrainians, and we're never there as far as Russia was concerned. So Ukraine couldn't handle this. They were still in disarray. Their army was a mess, but actually did pretty well considering. And then we had Minsk I, which calmed things down a little bit, but not a lot. So there was a non-ceasefire from September to January. There was still a lot of fighting. And then there was a big battle. That should say January 2015. It should be, the rest of them should be 2015. Debaltseve was where, in the winter, there was a battle. It ultimately did not go well for Ukraine, but they did pretty well considering that it was a lot of regular Russian tanks and Russian military involved. Another just crazy thing about them denying that they were there. The Russians are really, really bad with keeping things a secret. So, I mean, the Russian soldiers are sitting in front of Ukrainian signs like, hey, we're in Ukraine. And Russia's saying, no, we're not in Ukraine. So it's all on social media. It was, or they left the geotags on their pictures. So they would take a picture and it was geotagged in the middle of Ukraine. So we had Minsk II. That calmed things down quite a bit, and then we went into what is called the frozen conflict, which means that the war has not been decided, and they were constantly killing each other, shelling, up and down. It would be calm for a long time, and then a little flare-up. And that was going on all the way up until February of this year. So the point here is that there has been constant warfare between Russian forces and the separatists, I've still got to use air quotes, and the Ukrainians on the other side. Mind you, there are a lot of Ukrainians now in part of the separatist forces. They were in the Russian areas. They're bought and paid for fighting against Ukrainians. But it started out largely as Russians coming in. So we had the frozen conflict all the way up until 2022. Why did this happen now? Well, Putin has been trying to get Minsk II to be implemented, and if it was implemented, what would happen is that the separatist areas would become part of the Ukrainian state, but with more autonomy, and it was guaranteed to screw up Ukrainian politics. That was the goal. To have essentially these guys back in the Ukrainian government to screw around with it. And Ukraine quite correctly said no. And Minsk II was written really vaguely. So the Ukrainians say, you're supposed to pull your forces out first, and then we can reintegrate them. And Russia's like, no, you reintegrate them now while our forces are still there. And so for 8 years, that has been happening. Putin's been trying to get the West to pressure Ukraine into doing it their way, and the West was not having any of it. So that wasn't working. So for 8 years, this has been dragging on. Putin hasn't been getting his way. He's gotten a little impatient. Russia's economy has been going down, so and with no signs of it coming up. Ukraine's economy has been going up, and they've been coming stronger with the West. NATO has been getting stronger as well since after the previous administration. The new one under Biden was reestablishing the NATO wedges that Putin did manage to get in the last previous 4 years. And Putin is 70 years old, and he's thinking, I want to do this. I probably should get going, because the average Russian doesn't last too long after 70s. So all these things together had made him think, yeah, this is the right time to go. Russia's strategic goals is to destroy Ukrainian independence, wipe the nation. Putin doesn't even think of it as a nation, and he's outwardly said that. The Ukraine is not a legitimate state. They're supposed to be part of Russia. So he wants to rectify that by getting rid of the Ukrainian independence at all levels. But the other thing is he needs to eliminate a threat by example. This is a largely a nation that can speak in Russian and converse in Russian, has a lot of ties to Russia. The last thing Putin wants is for Russians to see Ukrainians getting more iPads and having a better life and not having to pay bribes all the time. This is really bad example. So he's got to get rid of that. NATO's is a big threat to him. So this is the funny thing, NATO is a defensive organization, but it's defending places he wants to attack. So if you carry the logic, it's a threat to him, because if he goes in there, NATO will attack back. So he wants to get NATO weak so that maybe he can do what he wants to do without NATO being a problem. And to cause as much trouble with the EU as possible. I didn't even mention Brexit. Holy crap, so much Russian money went into the whole Brexit thing. It was largely funded by the Russians. I mean, there was all kinds of scandals with the pro-Brexit groups having to explain where their money came from. So he was very happy about that, because anything that makes the EU weaker is a good thing for him. And then he's got to score points at home. His people are largely complacent, but that doesn't mean that they have endless complacency. And if he doesn't show something for them to be proud about, like Crimea, then they might get thinking that there could be something better. And he has to do it quickly, because all of the factors that are working against the Russian state right now are going in the same direction, and time is the enemy. So we wanted to get into Ukraine before anybody could figure out what happened, settle the question, then he would be able to have what he wanted to have after that. So the war that we have right now, unrealistic goals. Just completely didn't understand how much the Ukrainians hate the Russians in terms of the control. And so he thought they were all going to either collapse or welcome them as basically as a savior, and that didn't happen. So they had unrealistic goals, so they had an unrealistic strategy, military strategy, which was, we'll just drive in there, drive all over the place. The Ukrainians won't really bother us. We'll be like the Crimea takeover, which was very quick, very rapid. And before you know it, it will be over, and they won't even know what hit them. So unrealistic military strategy. Unfortunately for the Russians, there was a realistic military result, which was they have gotten their asses kicked a lot, and very, very hard. So this plan just completely fell apart. Predictable brutality. Russians are known for this. I mentioned Grozny. That's what was on everybody's mind, and it's exactly what he's doing, which is, if you don't get what you want, start murdering everybody, and maybe they'll just cry uncle. That is his plan B. He's already been doing it, and it's just wanton destruction. And if followed what they did in Syria, they were given a list of hospitals. The Russians were given a list of hospitals. Here, don't hit these places, they're hospitals. They used that as a targeting list, and they just started targeting all these places, even places that they hadn't targeted before. So hospitals are a favorite of theirs, schools, political institutions. These are all things that they deliberately target, and that's what they've been doing in Ukraine. So Putin gets a clue. This was all the forces in northern Ukraine, to most people, just suddenly withdrew. Those of us who were spending 6 hours a day following the war realized that Russia was about to collapse there. The attacks had gone so horribly. The Ukrainian defense was so effective that if they didn't pull their troops out, they were all going to just basically throw down their arms and go home. And some of them did. So he got a clue, pulled them all out, told his people, okay, we did what we came to do. We weren't really trying to take Kyiv or northern Ukraine. We were just trying to distract them. That's how he sold it to his people. And they bought it. Because that's what you do when you're brainwashed. So in reality, it was a massive military defeat. He took all the remains of his forces from there and has been feeding them back into the war further south, in hopes of getting a military solution there. Launched the offensive on Easter, So just a few days ago, most military experts who by now have figured out how badly the Russians are fighting have given the Russians very low odds of this working. And it seems, as of today, this is why I was checking in, they've called off the offensive. They haven't told anybody that they've called off the offensive, but it looks like that there was maybe some conflict between the army, the military, and Putin, and the military saying, if we do this, we're going to fail and we're going to collapse. And Putin finally, I think, maybe figured that out. And so that's the last thing Putin wants, is his military to just spontaneously collapse. He's already had problems. There's, and you just can't make this stuff up. So they've suffered such huge losses that they went out to the hinterlands of the Russian Empire to grab static units that have been sitting around in local garrisons and saying, okay, you're now going to go to an active war zone. And they took this one unit that was sitting in a piece of Georgia called South Ossetia, and they moved them in. They didn't treat them very well. They lost a whole bunch of men, and they said, screw it. And they hitchhiked home, 300 of them. And like I said, you cannot make this up. There's pictures of them all sitting on the guardrails of a highway closer to home. Some family members went and got buses and got a whole bunch back. So, I mean, it's just ridiculous. And then there's a whole problem with conscripts. They are still fairly large amount of their forces are conscripts. They're not supposed to be used in a conflict. Here we get into a problem where he's calling it a military operation, special operation, not a war. And Russia does have laws. They get ignored whenever they want to, but one of them is you can't use a conscript in war. So if he calls it a war, he can only use a conscript in the case of war. So if he calls it a war, he can use the conscripts. However, if he calls it a war, now people are saying, hey, but you said this was just a little kind of, adventure. It wasn't a massive thing. But so he's in a tough spot. And that is, really from the military standpoint where he's at now, he's in a really, a lot of us that were following this didn't think he was going to do a full invasion because we cased it out and we said there's no way he's going to win it. And he's got a risk of collapse. So Putin's pretty smart, he won't do it. About 2 days before the war started, a few of us are like, oh crap, I think he's going to do it. And then the war started, and I'm like, yep, he's doing it. And fortunately, it went the way we figured it would. And by the 10th day of the war, I was already saying he had lost. But sometimes it takes a lot longer for that reality to actually happen. But when you look at the objectives that he went in there for, the unrealistic goals, within inside of a couple of days, it was clear that he wasn't going to get anything that he wanted, which is even worse. He wanted to split NATO, and now Sweden and Finland, two nations that had been neutral all this time, are going to join NATO. So, well done, Vladimir. So, the West response, and I'm going to say this non-politically, one of the most brilliant things I've seen in my day is the Biden administration's decision to make the intel that was up before the war available publicly. This is something that is just, basically there's no precedent for this. And one of the reasons why they did that was he listened, and the experts on Russia said this is the best way to defeat the Russian plans. Best case, he'll call off the invasion because surprise is generally a good thing in a military invasion. If you don't have it, generally you don't want to keep going with it. So they figured that that might dissuade him from invading. It didn't work. So, but it might have. But at the very least, it got everybody ahead of time ready for this. And that did not work out in favor of Russia. Because, I'll get to that in a second. Limitations of power. Okay, we could end this war tomorrow afternoon. I mean, we have the forces in place right now that we could decimate the Russian military, like, without breaking a sweat. Problem with that is nukes. And there is a risk that if we went that far, that he would use what the most likely scenario is a tactical nuke, which is a small nuke. It would lay waste a town that would never be inhabitable again. So this is a real issue when people say that they want a no-fly zone. Yeah, I can say right now, Russia, no fly. That's about as good as it is unless we go in there and start killing Russians. So it kind of sucks. We got all this military power. We could stop all the suffering. We could stop the war. But then we risk a nuke. And if you didn't have nukes, we would have ended this. We did the same thing eventually in Yugoslavia, where ex-Yugoslavia. So, which is the other reason why he doesn't like NATO. Dismantling influence operations. That has been happening in earnest the last few weeks and months, which is all the stuff that we knew about that we didn't do anything about. Things have happened. I forget the count now. I think there's upwards of like, something crazy, like 200 Russian embassy personnel that have been kicked out of embassies all across the West because we knew that they were not embassy staff. We knew that they were intelligence officers. So they're all out. We've shut down various different rings that we knew were going on. They had a massive distributed network attack planned, and we knew where it was, and we unplugged it before they did anything with it. We've shut out their media. Microsoft has helped defeat certain vulnerabilities that were known but needed some help. And so that's been going pretty well. The sanctions. So one of the things that broadcasting the strategic intelligence happened is we were able to get together with our allies before the war actually started and started figuring out what we were going to do about it after the war started. And the sanctions we've imposed on Russia they're massive. And a couple of them, Russia even previously had said that they would start a nuclear war over if we did. And we did it anyway. We knew that was just a whole bunch of bluffing. But the Russian economy is going to pay a heavy price for this. They've already had to shut down multiple defense industries because they can't get parts. This is the problem when you're dependent on parts from some other nation. So, yeah, their large tank factory is offline because they cannot get the parts. They shouldn't have been getting the parts anyway, but that's a whole other thing. The economic sanctions are massive. There's a huge amount of money that we have frozen, and it's pretty much guaranteed that we're going to use that to help rebuild Ukraine afterwards. Hundreds of billions of dollars, which is good because the estimate right now is the physical infrastructure damage of Ukraine is already at $100 billion. So military aid, we have been sending all kinds of fun toys over to the Ukraine, and they have been using them very, very effectively. And so there's been a lot of wrangling about whether or not we should be sending heavier stuff or whatever. One of the problems is some of the stuff we have takes months to learn how to use. Not really practical for them to use right now today. But the stuff we have been sending over there has been helping the Ukrainians fight very, very well. I mean, Russia right now, the estimate is that they've suffered 20,000 dead, and that would probably mean somewhere around 60,000 wounded. This is of a force of about 200,000. And that's edging on almost 50% casualties. And this is a tiny little military that's doing this. The Ukrainians have estimated their own losses at about 1/10 of what the Russians have. And that's just for, on the military side of things, it's it's incredible. But not unexpected. The Russian morale is total crap. The Ukrainians is exactly the opposite. And that matters a lot. And that's why a lot of the Russian equipment was getting abandoned. Ukrainians would hit one tank, and the other tankers would say, "We're out of here." And they would leave the tank instead of taking the tank with them. So if you've been following, this is all the Ukrainian tractors going in and towing all the Russian stuff back. This is, memes. This is a meme war, and the Ukrainians are winning it hands down. This whole tractor thing has just gotten to be at such a level. In Finland, Russia moved forces up to the Finnish border to threaten them about joining NATO, like that would work. So the Finnish said, well, we're moving our forces to the border, and they showed a whole bunch of tractors driving up to the border, and basically implying that they're going to tow all the Russian stuff back once they did. I love the Finns. The Finns are so funny. A Swedish guy made this video that was in kind of the theme of the old corporate instruction videos, and it was all about advice of how to tow stuff out of the fields. It was to farmers, and it was like, well, you have to take into consideration how much horsepower your tractor has, and here's how you clip onto it, and here's watch out, the tracked ones tend to want to go straight. And so it was just done in this dry humor throughout the whole thing. It was hilarious, which is good. The Ukrainians, as much suffering as they are undergoing right now, all of the war crimes and everything, the destruction and the horror, they have kept an amazingly good sense of humor. I mean, the stuff I'm seeing out of Ukrainians that I know that are in Ukraine, they have not lost their sense of humor, which is good, because they really need to laugh at something because of the horror that's going on there. Humanitarian aid, there's a lot of it going in that doesn't get as much coverage, but there's about 6 million Ukrainians outside of the country right now, most of which are in Poland, and there's an estimated another 6 million internally displaced inside of Ukraine. Getting back to the broadcasting of strategic intel and what we did beforehand, we started moving in stuff into Poland for humanitarian assistance before the war began. That is how sure we were that the war was going to happen. We started sending in military units, and non-governmental organizations got the green light to go in to start setting up to get ready for refugees for a war that hadn't even started yet. And again, it's one of the most incredible things I've ever seen. And then finally, the NATO enlargement, the Finnish and Swedish applications they're going through the technical parts of it on their side. It's pretty much a given that Finland's going to do it. Almost certainly it's going to be Sweden as well. So to finish up, we've got where do we go from here? The war is still going on, obviously. It would appear that the offensive has stopped right now. That doesn't mean the fighting has stopped. There's still a lot of activities going on. There's still a lot of people dying and a lot of destruction. And Ukraine is not going to give up. This is why we were thinking that Russia should not screw with this. Should not go into Ukraine, because Ukraine is just not going to stop. And so, at best, Russia would be fighting an insurgency for indefinitely, and they're not set up for that. They also had, the guys of the Soviet Union had gone into Afghanistan for 10 years, and that didn't work out for them. First Chechen War didn't work out for them. The only reason why the second Chechen War worked out for them is that they, as I said, they bribed one of the two major powers, and those guys killed all the other guys. So they had somebody else doing their dirty work. Unfortunately, Russia is not really going to want to hear all of this. So We don't know what they're going to do because we don't see that they've got any option. Putin can spin this any way he wants and say, I'm going to end the war, but it doesn't end until Ukraine says it's going to end, and Ukraine is not going to let it end. And the West is not going to pressure Ukraine into stopping, which is the other thing that sometimes happens, is that the West says, maybe you should make a deal with them. Czechoslovakia and Germany, for example. And then that is not happening here. Nukes possible, but not probable. I don't really see any. Putin is not crazy. He's a nasty, nasty, nasty man, but he's not crazy. And if he's not happy with not getting what he's going to get now, he knows dropping a nuke will make it even worse for him. There's still a possibility for him retiring without being killed by his own people, or, we're not going to do it, but somebody around the table might. The war will wind down somehow. My personal pet favorite is a total military collapse, which he would have had if he had left his forces in Kiev any longer. But they're dangerously close to collapsing now. Like I said, those guys hitchhiking home, but there's a lot of other examples of units refusing. The Chechens are in place, in part, in some places, to do some convincing of the other forces that they should stay in the front. There was one incident which, who knows, not totally confirmed, but there was a bit of a mutiny, and some Chechens killed a couple of the guys, and the mutiny stopped. So this is not a good thing to have going on in your military, having to spend all your time shooting your own soldiers. Generally does not mean that you're going in a good direction. So the other possibilities is a coup, and these are not all mutually exclusive, by the way. There are people who are not happy with how this has went. He deliberately kept everybody out of the loop before he went in with this, which is different. Usually he got a sign-off from the oligarchs and some of the other major power players. He did not do that this time, probably because he knew that they would not want to go along with it. And since these guys have all had all their money frozen and they can't go to their place in south of Spain, they're not happy. Revolution, unlikely. That would be the population rising up against them. If that happens, it's not for political reasons about, freedom and whatnot. It's more like, I can't afford food and you need to go. And then civil war is entirely possible with at least some parts. The Chechens have been bought, and if they stop receiving their payments, they are likely to say, we're independent again. This is the problem when you have 100-something different ethnicities that are all kept together by force or bribes. And unfortunately, if Putin goes, the replacement is probably not going to be good either. We can hope that the next one won't be as interested in interfering with our lives as Putin was, and that is possible, but we're not going to get some nice, happy camper that we can now be friends with. And until something like that happens, the sanctions will almost certainly not be lifted on Russia, which is another thing that he didn't count on. And there was actual evidence that he was not expecting this amount of sanctions against him. And so he was not really thinking ahead too much on that. So that also increases the chance of a coup or revolution or a civil war, because if the economy gets as bad as it's going to get, and there's no hope of it coming back up, then people might think that they need to get rid of Putin. Mind you, the Russian economy can get to a sustainability level. It's just, it's going to be a crappy level. And the whole thing about Putin is Putin was making people's lives better. And so all of a sudden it gets dropped down and it doesn't get any better from that, then maybe they question the trade-off that they have made to have Putin be their leader. All things Belarus, real quickly, Belarus was also wavering. They had big protests. Russia went in there. Unlike Ukraine, Russia did manage to clamp down on the protests and so Belarus stayed within side of the Russian orbit. However, Russian forces went into Belarus on exercise, and those are the ones that invaded north of Kyiv. Putin has been trying to get the Belarusian military to invade as well. That didn't happen. We don't know why, but we have little bits of hints that Lukashenko, the dictator there, realized that if that happened, there would be a civil war pretty quick. Belarusian military is all conscripts. They have no interest in attacking Ukraine. They like Ukraine. There's actually a pretty charismatic Belarusian volunteer unit fighting the Russians right now. This guy's got this big handlebar mustache, and he's on all the social media. So there was actually some instances of sabotage by the railroad workers, because Russia's moving all their stuff by rail. Suddenly, rail lines started getting screwed up, and timetables, and so a whole bunch of railroad guys got arrested, and I think that got fixed, unfortunately. So Belarus is on a knife's edge, and Putin apparently realized that and stopped pressuring them to attack, because it would not have gone well. If you think the Russians have gotten their butts handed to them, the Belarusians are worse, so they wouldn't have made it more than 10 feet. So West will maintain sanctions until this thing's all over. Basically, that Putin's all over. Ukraine will rebuild. It's going to be very expensive. A lesson after World War II was that it's maybe not such a bad thing to lose all of your really old infrastructure, your outdated factories, and build fresh. And Ukraine's industry is Soviet. A lot of these things have been, places have been in buildings and whatnot, have been standing for 60, 70 years, and they're Soviet structures, which is, if you've ever been in a communist country, they are not very high quality. They are westernizing. Hopefully this will get a lot more of the corruption under control. Ukraine is in the process of joining the EU. The EU has standards that they're going to have to meet, and it's just been this, is Ukraine even ready to apply thing for a number of years? And now basically Europe's like, yeah, okay, send in your application. You're still going to have to meet our standards, but we'll get the process started. And that, by the sound of that and nothing moving there, I am at the end of my presentation.
Thank you.
So, I have no idea how long that would take. Oh, it was a lot longer than I expected. Any questions?
Do you think that Putin might have taken this chance to invade Ukraine because we have a spineless, incompetent president?
No, not at all. The exact opposite. He was hoping that things were going to go better for him in the previous administration, because the previous administration was hostile to NATO. And this was something that Putin really, really wanted. So he was going to invade one way or another. And as I said way back, there was a lot of their economy, Russia's economy going down, Ukraine's military becoming more competent. There was a point in time where Putin realized that he wasn't going to be able to invade. You got to remember, he wanted to invade. There's like...
And he's been wanting that for a very long time.
Yeah, and he invaded.
And they've known that he was going to invade, and they could have given Ukraine a lot better equipment.
So this is a good point. Here's the whole problem about escalation. Putin has made it very clear, and this is where he's gotten away with a lot of stuff. And I mean, you should see what he's done to our diplomats. I mean, FSB, which is the successor to KGB, went to one of our diplomats' house, shot his dog in the apartment in Moscow, and left. I mean, so what are you going to do about that? And so there's been a whole bunch of this stuff where he's just screwing with us. And it's been very difficult to respond to him because it's at kind of this level. And so it's tough. It's tough to respond incrementally. And so he has pushed those buttons using his money to influence people. The Germans have been a real problem with dealing with him because they're dependent upon the natural gas coming out of Russia. And Putin has bought a lot of German politicians. So when we decide to do something, the Germans, we have to go to the EU, it's their backyard, and the Germans are like, well, we don't really think we have to do that right now. Be nice to them. And every president has, US president, has thought, okay, we can reset the relationship with them, and we can try to start fresh. Every single president has done that with Putin. Never worked.
You really didn't have that much problems with Putin knowing Trump was president, because Trump let him know.
No,
Yeah,
that,
Trump kept the money from,
yeah, that's it. I gotta say, that's not true.
let's not go there.
It's really, it's just not true. Putin was hoping that the frozen conflict, so they've been fighting for 8 years. So all through the Trump presidency, the war has been going on in Ukraine.
None of the Americans died under Trump.
Well, no Americans have died except for the volunteers that went over there.
And
So-
all the people that got left in Afghanistan, I'm done. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Afghanistan was a Soviet, a Russian invasion, and we're dealing with the aftermath 20 years later. And there was a phone call, I need a favor though. Our help to Ukraine was slowed down by the past administration.
We,
I don't see it like that,
Yeah.
and I don't think Glenn Beck sees it like that, or Howie Carr, or a lot of people.
yeah, well, they're not correct. More could have been done, and I wish more had been done. If more had been done in the last, let's say the last couple of years, we would be, Russia still would have attacked. That there was nothing we could do to head that off. But there would be even more tanks smoking right now. But we're making up for it now.
And I think what Steve has actually done a really good job of with this entire thing is that across parties, this is not like really a political thing at all within the United States. It's more, global relations between the US and Russia and the Ukraine that have been going on, like you said, since the 9th century.
Yeah.
Which is why, you spent like 45 minutes on just the context of this thing before you even got into it. But a lot of history is that kind of stuff. It's not like,
Didn't come out of nowhere.
yeah, it's not individual people doing one thing. It's more, this came out of something that's been going on for centuries. And sometimes in the US, we have a short attention span to these kind of things.
2 to 4 years, that's our attention span.
But there's still people in Afghanistan that are mad about Alexander the Great taking over Afghanistan. It's, some places have centuries-long views of these that have nothing to do with,
Yeah. And
fair
and the-
tax rates or anything that we think of in American politics or history. It's
Yep, and the thing is that Putin wanted the Ukraine out of the way, and which president was in power doesn't matter to him. It's his goal has nothing to do with our politics.
I've got a couple of questions, but that culture piece that our embassies are putting up a rainbow flag, that Radio Free Europe was broadcasting into Russia, things that were wedge issues in the culture wars.
Yep.
So I really feel like there is something that we need to, the West needs to unify on and not pivot from and not let them have that leverage from.
Yeah, so the Russian culture, unfortunately, is kind of like an arrested state of development. The leader of the Chechens is Kadyrov, and his forces, which are in Ukraine, so Russia has it's not the same as our National Guard. They call it a National Guard, but they're essentially not in the regular military, but they're armed. And he's got a lot of them. and they are in Ukraine fighting right now. And their nickname is the TikTok Army, because all they do is they do these videos of their strong warriors, and just sitting there with the guns, just going, "Bop, bop, 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 bop," and they're, oh yes, we're in Mariupol fighting, and you can look around, there's nobody around. They're just blowing through ammunition. Their leader, Kadyrov, was supposedly visiting the troops in fighting in Ukraine, in Mariupol, and he's sitting there, they're Muslim, and he was doing his prayers and showing this. In the background was a Russian gas station that is not in Ukraine at all. So, they're not even that good at faking things. But this is just, those guys in particular, all this machismo, like, and the Putin whole, stripped down to the waist, riding a horse. It's just, it's maddening, but that works over there. And they've got a patriarchal society, very, very conservative, and Putin has used that stuff as evidence to his people that, oh, you don't want to have anything to do with the West. They're decadent. They believe in freedom and rights of people, and really that's the undercurrent of it, is that it's trying to take the things in the West, cherry pick the things in the West that his people aren't really inclined to like, and say, yeah, you don't want the whole Western package, political expression, freedom of speech, economic opportunities, because they have gay marriage. That's how they've been doing it. And it's, when you control all the media, and that's the messaging you give your people 24 hours a day, it is effective. Alan?
I have a bunch of Latvian friends that are very nervous right now. And in getting to know them, one of the things that I was incredibly surprised about was they actually hate the Russians.
Yeah.
I mean, hate is not even a strong word. But their antipathy toward the Germans is something that, as an American, I had a hard time understanding. But they've looked at the Germans in the war, in World War II, as actually liberators,
Yeah.
to a large extent.
Yeah.
And so that was something I really had a hard time understanding or grasping, that idea. And it's interesting that the whole Nazi thing is still being used, but it's being used by both sides.
Yeah.
In this particular conflict.
Yep. There was
And the Azov Brigade, I mean, that is a kind of a neo-Nazi organization.
some of them, a good
Yeah.
portion of them are. And,
Right.
and it's just funny to see a Russian soldier talking about fighting the Nazis, and he's got
Yeah.
SS symbols on. It's like, do you even see this stuff?
Right.
How good is your media control if you don't even bother? Well, actually, that's the depressing thing. When you see this stuff going off to the Russian people, and we're looking at going, you gotta be crazy. The Russians don't get it. It's like going right over their head.
Well, in all fairness, Americans don't either get much of this.
No, that's true, but
So,
but we're not the ones saying that this is a fight against Nazis or
No,
with Nazis,
yeah.
and, yeah. And the Baltic states, like I said with Ukraine's like, these Nazis aren't very good, but they're better than the Stalinists.
well, what you said earlier about, and that's the thing with Latvia, was that it's the Russians that they moved in after.
Yeah.
To dominate the population.
Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all have the same
All
problem.
of them have large Russian populations due to that.
And they watch Russian television.
Yeah,
Even though there's Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian television programming in Russian, they prefer to watch the Russian news. And this is not good.
When he gets Crimea, which I guess I understand is just, it was bragging rights for Putin, but now the Black Sea, he doesn't have access to the Mediterranean. He's just right
Not
up
right
against
now, yeah.
another NATO member, Turkey. So where is he, I guess I thought Kaliningrad, it would be the Baltic states, it would be Belarus that were vulnerable, but
But they're NATO
that's it.
members.
That's all he's gonna get to is just Turkey, and then he's right up against NATO again, and then do we have to invoke our
Well,
defensive
so,
obligations?
so the whole thing about Kaliningrad, that's another thing that you didn't anticipate. It has to go through Poland or Lithuania, and or Latvia, sorry, and they closed the borders. Actually, it was Lithuania. They closed the borders to cross traffic. So the only way that Russia can get stuff in and out is to fly out and around and come in, or send their own ships from St. Petersburg. Where that's going long-term, I don't know.
So is Kaliningrad losing interest in all of this
I
faster
have no
than-
idea, but Russia made sure that when they emptied out all the Germans and the Lithuanians and the Poles from there, that they put in hardcore Russians. So, I mean, this used to be East Prussia. You couldn't get more Teutonic German than that, and they're all basically gone. And so it's pretty much just Russians. And they also know that they're screwed without the support of the Russian state. But down in the Black Sea, yeah, I mean, the whole idea was that they were going to take the entire coastline of Ukraine away, all the way to Odessa, all the way down to the Romanian border, and that didn't work. Just another, like, you can't make this up. They took a Ukrainian port, they put 3 of their transport ships there. They only have, I think, 6 or something in the area. And they were within artillery range. So the Ukrainians sent a whole bunch of artillery over and sank one of them and burnt up 2 others that were damaged. This is the thing, we're all like, you put them right inside of artillery range. You have all the Crimea, you could have put them down there somewhere. And of course, Russia said that they were going to rebuild, minor damage. And you can see from the satellite imagery that the outline of the ship under the water looks a little bit more than just slightly damaged.
Who put out the fire, though?
It did. It did.
Kind of a leading question to see your response. Our policy during the Cold War basically revolved around the word containment.
Yes.
I'm wondering whether sanctions will be a new type of containment.
That is the hope. The real hope with, as opposed to containment was just keep them out of someplace, or keep them bottled up someplace, whichever way you wanted to look at it. Sanctions, the hope of sanctions is that it undermines or changes the calculations of who's ever targeted by the sanctions. So in a perfect world, the sanctions against Russia would create a better political system that would be less likely to go do things like this. That's the hope. It's not going to happen unless it gets so bad that, again, that the people just essentially say, we've had enough of this. The only way we're going to get rid of sanctions is get rid of Putin. Okay, then we'll get rid of Putin.
Well, I'm wondering whether containment will be a catalyst for getting rid of Putin from within.
We're hoping so. He has taken a lot of steps in the last couple of years to limit the options for that to happen. His circle of people around him has been shrinking and shrinking, and this is very typical of an autocrat. As they get older, they get more paranoid. They have killed a lot of people, and so that they realize that there might be somebody coming for them, and they take steps to try to mitigate the possibilities of being a victim. So there are people that I would be very surprised if there hasn't been already a few coup attempts that got squashed that we'll never even heard about. There was one in 2014, at least we're very suspicious there was one in 2014 during the first war. He disappeared for about 2 weeks and then came back, and a few other people were dismissed. And so that's usually usually a sign of some sort of crisis, whether it got really up to the level of coup or it was just a strong disagreement that got settled.
Is there any chit-chat about the sanctions from the sky? If Russian planes have to fly, hundreds and hundreds of miles to go through airspace.
You don't have to worry about that. They don't have the ability to fix their planes. They've already had to ground all their civilian aircraft. Not only did we block them from flying, overflying, the civilian ones, they said you can't fly to our airports, but they have no access to the parts. And so this will be an interesting thing that will take a little while to develop, is all the industries that are shutting down because of the sanctions, and that includes a lot of the consumer goods. Russia has a large consumer market like we do, and so all of these Western brands that have shut down the supply of shoes and handbags and whatever else, there are people that were hired to sell and stock and move those things around just like any retail. I mean, just think right now if somebody put Walmart or Target out of business, just put them out of business. There would be, in the case of Walmart, hundreds of thousands of people put out of work. But cumulatively in Russia, it's not as large, but we're still talking tens of thousands of people that are going to lose their jobs because, and there's no replacement for it. So the airlines are one, they've already laid off pretty much everybody. And if you're a flight attendant and there's no airlines anymore, it's not like you can go work for some other airline.
When he went into Georgia and other moments, there was always talk of, they don't let Russians vote. The former republics will not let Russians vote, and so we have to, is that even true anymore?
No.
Is that, okay.
No, and that's the thing, it was always about, that was one of the fake reasons.
Russian speakers, I guess is how
Yep, Russian culture is under threat. First of all, he doesn't care about people in general. So, right there, I saw a flow chart. It says, the flow charts with the logic things, and it says, this is how you know if Russia's lying. And the first one says something, and just narrow it down to lie, which there is no interpretation of any other, there's no if, ands, or buts. It's just right lie, or the old one we have is, how can you tell a politician is lying? Because their lips move. It's pretty much it. The whole culture thing, that is an old Russian Empire, Soviet Empire, now the new Russian Empire, Russian Federation. That's why they put them there in the first place. Not because they really care about them, but they could use it as an excuse. Ukraine was willing to negotiate on a whole bunch of these minor points. Recognizing Russia as the official second language, for example. Making sure that Russian history and Russian culture was allowed and taught in schools. Ukraine was open to that. They actually were never going to ban it anyway. They were getting rid of all the Soviet stuff. They tore down the statues, they renamed the roads. That pissed Putin off a lot, because it's, again, the symbology of it.
So, I have kind of a theory, and I kind of wanted to run it past you too. Throughout the whole Cold War, the U.S. didn't really have, honestly, all that much to offer besides money to developing countries. The Soviets could offer revolution and breaking away from your colonial oppressors, things like that. The U.S. could offer money, which mostly went to the officials they picked.
Yeah, and not good people usually.
And even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we put Yeltsin in power. Well, we didn't put Yeltsin in power, but Yeltsin was very friendly to the U.S., and everyone saw him as an incompetent drunk, which is
There's some
debatable.
theory now that he was being slowly poisoned
Yeah.
at the end.
Yeah.
And that was one reason why he was starting to be a little shaky and whatnot. It's because he wasn't checking what was in his tea.
But I see a lot of the late stage Putin things, the last 10 years or so, maybe less, as almost like a reset of that, where Russia has almost nothing to offer to the world at large besides corruption and incompetence, and the U.S. is just kind of a beacon of like getting away from those kind of authoritarian. Do you see that?
Oh,
at all? Yeah.
And that's, it's the real shame of it. Russia could, if it wanted to, have a lot to offer the world. They are smart, industrious people. They've got a lot of natural resources. They are the largest country in the entire world by far. Yeah, there's a lot of good that could come out of Russia. However, this is like saying, going back and saying, well, you know, if Hitler was just a little bit nicer of a guy, he could have made a strong Germany and righted the wrongs of World War I, and okay, maybe redrew a boundary or two of territory that was maybe taken away from them too hastily. And he could have just stopped there.
Mhm.
And then, you know, wouldn't that have been great? Well, the problem was that the whole reason for being was at odds with the nicer thinking. And so one term that has been used for Russia, Putin's form of Russia, is a kleptocracy, which is a government that exists simply to steal from its people. There's a fine line between that and just your regular dictatorship, because that's what dictators do. So some people have thought that it was more of a bureaucratic, hey, we don't really care about our history, we're just here to steal from everybody. And that's a kleptocracy. But it has really transitioned to rebuilding of the Russian might. And so that's now more akin to fascism. So it is kind of also interesting that all the history of communism, that he didn't return back to that.
Yeah.
He went off to the other direction. But if you look at a political spectrum, it's not this with a hard line underneath it, rainbow type thing. It's a circle, and there's just a thin line between the difference between the hard line left and a hard line right. It's mostly just rhetoric. If you look at their deeds, like I said, the Soviet Union was more murderous than the Nazis. They were just less discriminatory. They killed pretty much everybody. The Nazis were at least a little bit more specific.
And I wasn't trying to say anything like
Yeah.
rah, the U.S. has never done anything bad, because that's absolutely. I mean, we're doing bad things
you're right.
in Yemen right now, or you
Yeah.
know, throughout the globe. But it's just weird for me, from having studied history too. It's like a weird, just complete flip flop, and I don't see how the current Russian regime is very stable at this point. But I don't know what could. Do you have any clue about what could replace
That's
it?
the problem.
That isn't just another
It's
Putin
just gonna be-
under
Another
another name.
Libya,
Yeah.
it's gonna get worse.
Well, so the other option is that he goes, that Putin doesn't get out of power, we keep the sanctions on him, and it becomes basically another North Korea. Nobody will talk to him, nobody will deal with him, everybody hates him. And big military with, well, much smaller military now, nukes and repressive in all ways, shapes, and forms, and that is a possibility. But Putin has a limited lifespan, and so one way or another, he is going to die. And unlike the North Koreans, which is a family dynasty, when Putin goes, there's going to be a real rumble for who takes over from him.
So kind of almost like when Stalin died. But then Khrushchev was a more palatable
Yes.
version.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's the thing, and that's why the Ukrainians, one of the first things he did was he tried to kind of quiet down the Ukrainians, which Stalin was all about, well, here's how I quiet them down. I kill a whole bunch of them. But you got me thinking, so Germany in particular, in their relationship with Russia and kind of squashing a lot of the things, and the UK as well, up until recently, trying to squash things that would punish Russia. It's in some ways, it's similar our relationship with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a horrible country. They create all kinds of problems. They were responsible for most of the terrorists who attacked us in 9/11. They murdered a guy in their embassy, and we know this. Do we do anything about it? No, because they supply us with oil and money, lots of it. So that's pretty much akin to the German relationship, which is, and the Germans are already already waffling, because industry went to their chancellor and said, hey, when can we go back to the way it used to be? This has been really rough on us. And it's not. I mean, they're waffling here and there, but they realize that they can't kind of keep sweeping this one under the carpet. And I really just don't know how the war is going to end. I have military collapse would then cause something else to happen inside of Russia, but whether it was, we already saw one thing. They had peacekeepers sitting in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was a war that just happened there. They removed a whole bunch of them, and Azerbaijan then went and marched their troops in. I mean, it's already, that happened a few weeks into the war. So there's a whole bunch of people that are not happy with Russia, and something's gonna, it could be like dominoes, like when the Soviet Union broke up. It wasn't just one republic left. It just imploded.
How does Kazakhstan seem, where they just invited Putin in?
Yeah, and then they
Before.
didn't back him. He must be pissed. In the
So-
UN, they did not back him. So, same thing with Belarus. Seems to have done what he needed to do when he was in there. Doesn't look like there's anything new happening, but, if Russia collapses internally, then, yeah, all kinds of things are gonna happen.
Did I hand folks a flyer or two, if you wanna give one to a friend? The church in Sangerville is gonna do it's Earth Day tomorrow. Come light a candle for Chernobyl, refugees for climate, war.
I just read that the University of Maine kids are all gonna paint themselves green and bicycle naked.
Again?
Apparently it went well the first time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
This,
I got two.
sunflower, Lori is gonna do music tomorrow, if you can make it. And, it raised $4,000 for, she auctioned it off for Doctors Without Borders, so.
And I think that's kind of the other side of all this. I mean, we've been mostly talking about like, military logistics and tactics and geopolitical things, but I don't think anyone is going to deny that this is a horrible humanitarian crisis, first and foremost. So, yeah.
Yeah, and even if the war ended tomorrow, it's gonna take a long time for this to get sorted out. Long, long, long time. Okay, well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.